Hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth talk in our series, The 9 Lives of the Ure Museum's Cat's Head. My name is Rachel Mairs and I'm Professor of Classics and Middle Eastern Studies at Reading. Today I'm going to be talking to you about a slightly less glamorous, but I think fascinating, aspect of our cat mummy, the bandages in which it would originally have been wrapped. Many museums across the UK have mummified animals or people from ancient Egypt in their collections. When I was a child, my local museum was the Ulster Museum in Belfast, and there I got to know a young woman named Takabuti, who lived in Thebes in southern Egypt, modern Luxor, more than 2,500 years ago. The picture on the slide here is Luxor Temple, which Takabuti will have known well, with the lovely and also very ancient Abul Hagag Mosque nestled within it. You might well ask how Takabuti got to Belfast. Well, her body and coffin were purchased almost 200 years ago by a man named Thomas Gregg, who travelled in Egypt, and he gave them to the Belfast Natural History Society. In 1835, the famous Egyptologist Edward Hincks conducted an unwrapping of Takabuti's mummy. This was a major event and was reported in the newspapers. The linen industry has been very important in Belfast for a long time. My own grandparents worked in linen mills, and what the observers of the unwrapping of Takabuti were mostly interested in were the linen bandages in which she was wrapped, not really the mummy itself or any of the ancient artifacts. The wrapping and unwrapping of human and animal mummies from ancient Egypt is something that scholars have begun again to look at more carefully in recent years. If you want to find out more, I really recommend Christina Riggs's book, Unwrapping Ancient Egypt. Another thing which I find very striking about the newspaper reports about the unwrapping of Takabuti is how much care was taken to prepare her body after death, and how little concern was shown by the people who unwrapped her body again thousands of years later. I recently had the opportunity to attend a really moving and fascinating panel discussion organised by the Egypt Exploration Society, the project Egypt's Dispersed Heritage, and the blog Everyday Orientalism, in which museum professionals from Egypt, the UK, and North America discuss the ethics of dealing with human remains from ancient Egypt, now in museum collections. I like to think, however fascinated we may be by her bandages, that we wouldn't treat Takabuti quite so carelessly today. Just like Takabuti, our Ure cat would originally have been wrapped. You can see some more complete examples of cat mummies in these ones from the collection of the British Museum. There are various materials which could have been used to wrap the Ure cat. We've already talked a bit about linen, which is woven from the flax plant. This was the main textile produced in ancient Egypt, and we're very lucky that the climate of Egypt means that some ancient fabrics have been preserved, like this example from the Ure Museum. And you can see in this painting a modern copy in the Metropolitan Museum of Art of an ancient Egyptian original, people in the fields harvesting flax. But there was another material used in Egypt for wrapping mummies, which was papyrus. Now you may be familiar with ancient Egyptian literary and funerary texts, like this beautiful example from the British Museum, which stays with our agricultural theme. But papyrus was also used for everyday writing tasks, like personal letters, tax returns, and all sorts of other more mundane activities. The piece on the top right of the slide is an agreement about harvesting a crop of dates, which I worked on a few years ago. It's written in Greek and comes from the 1st century AD. When people no longer had any use for their papyrus documents, they threw them out on rubbish dumps or they recycled them. One of the industries which made most use of recycled papyrus was the mummification business. Animal mummies, like our cat mummy, were often wrapped in waste papyrus. Papyrus was also used on human mummies, and was even used to make a kind of papier-mâché, known as cartonnage by Egyptologists, to craft elaborate mummy cases. This gorgeous example on the left of the slide is now in the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and we see here a smaller fragment from UCL. Naturally, cartonnage like this can often contain interesting texts on papyrus, which we can piece together and read. This can add to our understanding of ancient literature, history, and society. But there has to be a balance between preserving and appreciating a piece of history and work of art like this mummy case and retrieving papyri. Sadly, some unscrupulous dealers and collectors wantonly destroy mummy cartonnage in the search for papyri. You can read more about this on Dr. Roberta Mairs' blog, Faces and Voices. What kinds of things do we find on recycled papyri used in wrapping mummies like the Ure cat? We find works of literature, of course, but I'd also like to tell you some more about my own particular research interest, which is documentary texts. People in Egypt continued to mummify their dead and to dedicate animal mummies long after Egypt had ceased to be an independent kingdom. In the late 4th century BC, Egypt began to be ruled by a Greek dynasty, the Ptolemies. You may have heard of the dynasty's most famous member, Cleopatra. And in the late 1st century BC, it became part of the Roman Empire. This means that the languages people were using to write on papyri became much more diverse. Most of the examples I'm going to show you here are in Greek, but of course there was also the indigenous Egyptian language, as well as Latin, Aramaic, Hebrew, and many others. On the right is the papyrus document about harvesting a date crop, which I showed you before. It was used in wrapping a mummy. On the left is a piece that was used to wrap a crocodile mummy. It may not look like much, but it's interesting because the writer used both the Egyptian and the Greek languages, showing that they were bilingual. One of the most exciting things that has come out of a mummy cartonnage in recent years is a book of poems by a Greek poet named Posidippus, most of whose works had been lost until they were published from this papyrus in 2005. This is one of his poems at the top of the slide. I like it because it shows how multicultural Egypt was in this period. A man in Alexandria having a Persian stone engraved for his girlfriend, who is from the island of Kos in the Aegean. Well, from the sublime to the ridiculous, here's another favourite papyrus document of mine from the 3rd century BC. This is a letter written by a man named Heraclides, complaining to the king, as all inhabitants of Egypt had a right to do, that he had got into a fight with a woman named Xenobastis, and that she threw a chamber pot over him. I like to imagine this letter being passed around the office for everyone to have a good laugh. But there's also a more serious angle to this letter, which is the attitude Heraclides has towards Xenobastis because she is Egyptian. He thinks he deserves special treatment as a Greek. I'm going to finish with a papyrus that may not have come from wrapping a mummy, but is a nice example of the kind of things we find when we read people's letters from ancient Egypt. This is a young girl writing to her father, who has gone down to the city. As you can see, she's sending him quite a list of presents she wants when he comes home. What kind of thing do you think might have been written on papyri used to wrap the Ure cat? And how would you feel about people in the future reading papers you had thrown away for recycling?